Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Islandora webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about managing metadata for discovery purposes. Thank you to everyone who has already arrived and for those joining the webinar right now. We actually have a record number of participants this month, and of course, we'll be recording the webinar so that we can share it on YouTube later on. And we'll be sending that link to everyone who registered. So let's get started. And I'll just start by saying my name is Erin Tripp, and I'm a librarian based in New Brunswick, Canada. And I've been involved in the Islandora community since 2011. I'm very happy to be hosting the webinar today. And as I mentioned, of course, we are going to be recording this session, and it will be shared on YouTube. Unfortunately, I feel that we're having a bit of trouble with our audio. I'm just going to check into it before we move on. One moment, please. My apologies for the problem with the audio. I'm getting reports from some people that you can hear me and from others that you can't. My colleague Adam Smith is looking into it right now. My apologies. For those of you who cannot hear, I guess this isn't going to help, but there is an audio conference line that you can join, and the details for that are in the welcome email or in the email. All right, so let's keep going. I'd like to again introduce myself. My name is Erin Tripp, and I'm the Business Development Manager at Discovery Garden. I'm also a librarian and have been involved in the Islandora community since 2011. My contact details are up on the screen. So my email is erin@discoverygarden.ca. And also, we have some Twitter information as well. So my Twitter handle and the Discovery Garden Twitter handle are up on the screen. If you'd like to tweet during this webinar, great hashtags to use so that we can find your content are Islandora and Islandora June webinar. And my colleague Adam Smith will be live tweeting the webinar as we go along. Some of you may be hearing the beeps. I'm sorry about that. That is a beep from Join Me telling me that folks are joining. Unfortunately, I cannot turn the beeps off. So I will be, we'll have most of our participants joined in the next couple of moments. I'd also like to note one little feature of Join Me is that there is a chat window. So there's a small chat icon at the top of your screen. So for those of you who are listening live, you can ask questions. Just type them into the chat window and we'll read them out at the end of the session. So right after the webinar content, we'll be doing a Q&A session. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to be doing a very quick Islandora overview for folks who are new to Islandora. And then we're going to be getting into the meat of today's webinar. We're going to talk discovery settings. We're going to talk about configuring record display. And we're also going to be talking about getting indexed in Google and Google Scholar, and how to have your digital repository harvested by aggregators through the Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting. So lots to get into. We're only 5 minutes in, so we better get into the goods here. So I mentioned first we're going to do a very quick overview of Islandora. Islandora is an open source technology stack, and it consists of 3 core components. Those components are Drupal, Apache Solr, and Fedora Commons. And the stack also includes a lot of utility components and dependencies as well. It's quite a large stack. It includes many applications. This means that Islandora developers really are experts in integrating third-party tools because Islandora is a framework. So let's talk about each core component individually, and we're going to start with Drupal. Likely a lot of you are familiar with Drupal. It's the leading open source content management system. It has over 30,000 user contributed modules and over 100,000 active community members and developers. So Drupal serves as the presentation layer for Islandora, and it's how we expose our digital repository to the internet, essentially. Of course, we also use Drupal for a lot of other things. We integrate in a lot of Drupal utility modules. And we also leverage Drupal for the user role and permission framework. So it's how we manage workflow for our digital repository. So that user role and permission framework is integrated into a lot of tools within Islandora. It's also worth noting here that, that in essence, Islandora really is a suite of Drupal modules. And these modules allow us to build a repository on top of Fedora Commons. So these modules, they manage repository CRUD operations. And for those of you who are familiar with the term CRUD, it stands for create, read, edit, and delete operations. So those modules help us build digital repositories on top of Fedora Commons without the aid of a developer. So the next core component is Apache Solr. Apache Solr is used for discovery within Islandora, and it's a really powerful and flexible tool. It can be configured for just about any use case you could imagine. The key features of Apache Solr are that it provides full text search, faceting and filtering for narrowing search results. It also provides highly scalable and fault-tolerant discovery services and near real-time indexing when you ingest content. And of course, we're going to be talking a lot about the discovery layer in this presentation. So we'll get into more detail on Apache Solr in a moment. So the final core component, and certainly not the least important by any stretch of the imagination, is Fedora Commons, and it's the layer that stores and preserves digital content. So it's the preservation layer of Islandora. Fedora Commons is built for data preservation and long-term data accessibility, and it has some wonderful key features such as auditing and fixity checks, RDF XML support. We're able to scale Fedora Commons to millions of objects, and it has support for virtually any file type. Also, which is something that's very important, is that it is built for interoperability. So in the future, you can export or migrate your data without barrier. Okay, so just a couple more slides, 2 more slides until we get into the metadata management bit. I want to say just a quick word about Discovery Garden, the company that I work with. So Discovery Garden is an Islandora service provider, and we essentially provide services that help remove barriers for organizations that would like to use open source technology like Islandora. We launched in 2010, so we've been around for about 6 years, and we're a partner in the Islandora Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar with the foundation, it's a nonprofit entity that fosters the Islandora code. So since we've launched, we've contributed a good deal of code to the Islandora code base, primarily in the move from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7. And we offer an awful lot of Islandora repository services. I won't get into them now, but we do have a link on the screen that will guide you to our website. All right, so we're going to get into now metadata management for the purposes of discovery. And so the focus of this webinar is how we can leverage metadata once the content is already ingested into the repository. So we're not talking about managing metadata or pre-processing metadata for ingest. We're talking about metadata that is already living inside the repository and can be leveraged for discovery and harvest. So if folks are looking for information on metadata management in the pre-processing phase, migration or ingest, I have some tips that I can share with you at the end of this. In essence, I'll be pointing you to the Islandora Metadata Interest Group. They did a really wonderful meeting a couple of months ago on how to pre-process data for ingest. But okay, so before we get into the meat here and talking about configuration details, I do want to talk a little bit about why we should care about metadata management and why we should care about discovery in general. I was at the Open Repositories Conference in Dublin earlier this month, and one of the keynote speakers said something that really resonated for me. She said, if you can't find it, it doesn't exist. And I think it is true, and I also think it's really scary because we allocate so much time and so many resources toward digital curation. And it's such a shame that if we don't prioritize discovery, no one is really getting the value of the work that we're doing. So that really stood out for me. If you can't find it, it doesn't exist. That's something that I think will guide me in my metadata management and discovery webinars and training sessions over the next little while. Of course, this point is not new. This isn't a revelation. This has been discussed for quite some time in our community. So, for example, in February 2015, the LIDA Top Technology Trends panel, they were discussing enhancing discoverability as a top trend. And when they talked about enhancing discoverability, they really meant making content accessible where searches originate. And this means Google, Google Scholar, WorldCat, DPLA, and Europeana, Primo, Summon, custom-built search interfaces, you name it. It's highly unlikely that the average user is going to know the URL to our digital repository. So not only do we have to optimize search and discovery on our digital repository website, but we also have to make that content accessible elsewhere. So interesting, a fun fact, let's say, that making your content accessible where the search originates can have some really amazing benefits. So for example, the DPLA website, they have said that repositories that are contributing to DPLA have seen between 55 and 109% increase in site visits. That's pretty incredible. I've also heard anecdotally from folks in the community that when you can provide measurable statistics for a discovery on your digital repository and how they've been impacted by the projects and initiatives that you've undertaken, they can act as a big incentive for people to deposit into your digital repository. So anyone out there that has difficulty in enticing people to deposit content, making discovery a priority can really help provide an incentive for people to deposit. So that's why we should care. So first, we're going to talk about how to optimize search on our websites, on our digital repository sites. And Solar Settings is a place in Islandora where we can configure how our users experience search on the repository site. So the utility has terrific documentation, which I have linked on the slide. And this is just a quick look of the interface. And we're going to be going to a demo site here in a moment. But it's worth noting that in earlier iterations of Islandora, this type of interface didn't exist. So when we moved from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, we were able to build a lot of really terrific Drupal user interfaces to make discovery settings accessible to the average administrator. And by what I mean by that is to say that you didn't have to be a developer to configure your discovery settings on your repository. So I'm going to go now to a demo site, and we're going to take a look around the Solar Settings interface, and I'll just show you around and how to add fields to this setting. All right, so this is just a demo site that I have up and running. And I'll note that I'm already logged in, and I can tell because I have Logout and Hello Islandora here in the top right-hand corner. And I can also see this administrative menu at the top with the black background. So that's how I know I'm logged in and logged in as an administrative user. So to get to the Solar Settings interface, I first click on Islandora here. And then I go to Solar Index near the bottom of the list. And then I look up at the tabs near the top right-hand corner and I click on Solar Settings. So solar settings, this interface is where the bulk of my discovery configuration is going to happen. I head here to configure my search result display, so which fields will display in a search result. I also come here to configure sort settings here, also facets or filters, and also search, advanced search. So those are the four main settings that we'll be working with today. And the other thing that's worth noting here is that you can identify what the default display profile will be for your search results. You can choose list or grid. These are the two most common. Bookmark and table are very rarely used, and so I won't go over them. Other thing to note is that you can also provide the ability to export your search result to a CSV or to an RSS feed. And so if you configure that, you click these boxes and click Save, you'll have icons that represent those exports on your search result page. Excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of water. One moment. Okay. So we'll go first to default display settings, and I'll just give you an example of how you can manage default display settings for your search results. So semantically, default display settings is probably not the clearest language, but this section is where we configure search result fields. And you can see here I already have a number of fields configured. I have mods title info title. I have something called FGS label. That's probably not self-explanatory. FGS label, or any field that starts with FGS in Islandora, it means that it's generated by Fedora, so it's a machine-generated field or value. The next one is PID, and PID stands for persistent identifier. I'll note before moving on that these two fields here would likely be good candidates to only be visible to administrators and not to the average user. And I'll show you how you can limit the access to certain fields by user in a moment. We have MADS title. If you're wondering why there are multiple titles, the reason is that MODS title would probably be used to describe documents like PDFs or books, images, videos. MADS, on the other hand, is most often used in Islandora to describe entities like people, places, events, or organizations. So having both configured means that if a person ends up in your search result, their title will appear, and if a PDF shows up in your search result, its title will appear. And I should also say that by default, this setting will omit empty values, so that if you do have a large list of fields configured here, your search results display won't be too messy or cluttered with empty values, or empty fields rather. So I won't go through the rest of them individually, but just to note that there are a number of fields configured here. If I wanted to reorder the way that these fields will display in my search result, I can drag and drop them. And I can also remove them. It's very easy to remove a field, and I can just click remove here on the right-hand side, and it will go away. And I'll just save that change. So the other thing to note is that it's really easy to add a new field as well. In essence, you use this add another item area here, and you can see that there is a little circle at the end of the text area. What that indicates is that it's a lookup field. So I can start typing in a field name, and it will match any field that is indexed in the discovery layer, that's indexed in Solar. So I can start typing date, and I can see that there's a long list of date types that are indexed in Solar. And I'll actually choose dc.date. So now it's been added to my table. It's been added to my list. I'll also show you that it's very easy to configure a field that has been added to a search or discovery setting. We just click the configure option here. And we always add a human readable label, otherwise the field label will display in its entirety, which can be pretty ugly. So we'll call it date. And I'll note here as well that you have the ability to restrict certain fields by role. So I can say that everyone can access date. And I mentioned earlier the PID and the FGS label fields. These are actually already configured only to be available to the administrative role. And I'll just take a look at this. So we here have persistent identifier, and we have enabled permissions, and only administrators can see this field. So that's just a quick look at the search results settings. In essence, you can leverage any field that is indexed in your repository to display in your search results. One thing that is very important to note, though, is that once you configure this, you do need to check this box that says limit results to fields listed above. Otherwise, your search results will be very ugly and will include, in essence, every field that is indexed on every result in your list. So it's very important to check this box and click Save. The settings for the other three options, sort, faceted, and advanced search, these are all the exact same process for adding and configuring fields. One thing to note is that there is no configuration interface for basic search. That's a really common question that we get. Basic search doesn't have a configuration interface because basic search just searches everything. And the point there is that you cast a wide net through basic search, and you can further refine your results through filters or facets. So the other thing I'll note here, this is a kind of a trick that I've picked up over time, is that in the sort settings in Islandora, it does have a bit of a limitation. And I shouldn't say a bit, it's a pretty big limitation. So in sort settings, we're not able to configure any repeating field. So if, of course, if Dublin core is our schema, you think, well, how on earth do we do that? They all repeat. So the way to troubleshoot this limitation of sort settings is to select machine-generated fields. So you can see here that FGS, or the Fedora-generated label, this is a field that is mapped from mods title info title or from DC title. And also dates make really good parameters for sorting as well, because if you select a date field, it can often be unique and not a repeating field. So that's just a tip that I'll pass along for anyone who is having difficulty with sort settings or is planning on configuring sort settings for their digital repository. So I won't go through in detail the facet settings and advanced search block. I'll just note that, I'll note again that there are configuration settings, of course, to add fields and also to show minimum and maximum limits as well. So at the risk of running out of time, I'll actually move back to our slides and we'll get on with record display. So Islandora now has a tool that allows a repository administrator to customize a record display for each content model. So there is really great documentation for this module. It's called the Metadata Display module, and I've hyperlinked it on the screen. I'll go back to the demo site to show you around this interface. So I'm going to exit out of Solar Settings, but just note that Metadata Display here is on a tab, but we're going to navigate here from scratch. So to get to Metadata Display for record configuration, we click on Islandora at the top of the screen, and then we select Metadata Display. So here we can see that we have a couple of options. For a long time in Islandora, the default metadata display or record display configuration always used Dublin core. So for those of for users that used mods, they often would prefer to display mods in the record because it can be more granular. So we created this new module that would enable us to shy away from the default display of Dublin Core and to choose Islandora Solar Metadata, which is a new module. And the configuration option is just to the right-hand side of this table. So we'll click Configure, and I'll give you a quick tour around the configuration interface. So it's going to start you off at field configuration, but I actually prefer to start at general configuration. So this is a place where we can select the option to omit empty values. This is really important, especially if you have a large metadata profile for your repository, and especially if different types of content have dramatically different types of metadata associated with it. And you can also omit duplicate values here as well. So this is a really important place to configure when you are customizing record display. So next we'll go to field configuration. And you can see here that we have a record display, or I guess a field configuration per content model. You can see here we've given it a name, and we have associated content models here in the middle. So this is interesting because having a record display or a metadata display associated with a content model may be a departure for you. If you're coming from Content DM, you may have had the opportunity to have collection level metadata display. This is different in Islandora, and so the rule of thumb here is that we always do configuration based on a content model level, not on a collection level. So you can see here that we have fairly granular displays. And so for a scholar profile, we have the Islandora person content model associated. Another example would be the audio mods record display has two content models associated. It has the audio and the PDF content model. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that you can have very granular record displays per content model. However, that's not necessary. If you have really similar metadata for all of the types of content or most of the types of content in your repository, you can have far fewer configuration profiles here. So for example, you could have a general field configuration and have most of your Islandora content models associated with it. So the configurations here are just for demonstrative purposes, but it is worth noting that you can have dramatically different configurations if needed. I'm just reading a quick question here from someone named Brandon. So he says, I see that the PDF content model is associated with several profiles. What's the effect of that? For example, having a content model associated with multiple profiles. That's a really good question. So in essence, you're not supposed to have a content model associated with multiple profiles. It's something that you would want to avoid if possible. The reason why it is happening here is because this is a demo site, and we often will add a content model association during a demonstration. But that's a super good point that you do not want overlap between field configurations or profile configurations. Thank you very much for that question. All right. So let's take a closer look at one of these record display configurations. For example, why don't we take a look at the large image mods. So the large image content model in Islandora is designed for TIFF images and JP2, so high resolution images. We can see here that there is one content model affiliated with this profile, and we can add additional content models if we wanted to. We would essentially just select one from the list and then add the association, but we're not going to do that right now. We'll scroll down a little bit to the display field section, And we'll just take a look at the mods fields that are configured for display. It's quite a long list, and you might be thinking to yourself, not all of the objects in my repository would have values for all of these fields. That is why in the general configuration, it is so important to configure the omission of empty values. That way you won't have a messy record on the object view in your repository. So it's also worth noting, similar to the solar settings interface, that you can drag and drop the order of these values. So you can do some trial and error and see what your record looks like. You're also able to edit all of the values here to give them a display label. And you can also configure if you need to truncate the value. For example, if you were to configure full text or OCR as part of your record display, you may want to truncate it and add ellipses at the end to indicate truncation. And so in essence, the adding a new field is the exact same process as you would in solar settings. So we can start typing a field. I know I did date before, and I'll do it again. So I'll scroll down and select DC date, and I'll add it to my list. I'll save it. And once I've saved it, I'm able to configure it or edit it. I'll change the display label from DC date simply to date, and I'll save that configuration. So you can see, or you can start to see, that managing the metadata that is displayed in search results and also displayed in your record is fairly easy to do. One note is that making configurations for your discovery layer on your repository site will require a certain knowledge of your repository content and also the schema that you're working in. So knowing which fields you're looking for and where values are stored within your content is really important. So the configuration of the discovery layer in Islandora can take some trial and error. So configuring fields, saving your settings, and then going and running some searches to see what it looks like. So that's always a really good a recommendation that I provide to folks, and allowing yourself the time to do these configurations, test them, and get feedback. The wonderful thing about these interfaces existing is that we can take an iterative approach to discovery settings. For example, in the past, when we needed developer intervention for discovery, it was really difficult to iterate because it involved more people and more time. So we're really lucky that we have these interfaces available to us, and in that it's a lot easier than it used to be. One other thing I'll just very quickly look at before we move on to XML sitemap is there is one more Islandora setting for search that isn't under solar settings or metadata display. And I'll just go to the Islandora menu and Islandora utility modules, and I'll just show you collection search. So this is a way for us to create a search for specific collections. So you can see here that I can select whatever collections I want to display in my collection search, and that I can also provide some configurations about how that collection search will look on my results page. And I'll give you a quick look at how it looks in a production environment. So Islandora Collection Search is the module that is running this search on the Metropolitan New York site. So I can just do a search for lobster, let's say. I'm searching all collections. I can select an option. And you can see here that the collection search will default to the collection where this object lives. So that's really important feature. It's fairly new, and it may not be very well known. So just to let people know that Islandora Collection Search can be a really wonderful tool for those who would like an individual search experience. So I'm heading back to my handy slides here. We're going to move on to XML sitemap. And so XML sitemaps, they essentially will tell search engines about pages on a site, on a website. They tell a search engine about the relative importance of pages on a site and also how often they're updated. And so this helps visitors and also search engine bots find pages on a website. So that's just the general XML sitemap description. Islandora does have an Islandora XML sitemap module, and it will add URLs for Islandora objects to the XML sitemap for your repository. And so it just adds links to the database that stores that information, so that when a bot from Google or Bing or some other search engine comes around, they'll be able to get to a higher level of granularity for indexing. So the XML sitemap module is well documented, of course. Anything that's included in an Islandora release, they go to they are well documented by the Islandora documentation interest group, and so you can check out the documentation for yourself and follow along if you'd like. One other thing to note is that for those of you who put a pretty big importance on being discoverable in Google Scholar, you will need more than the Islandora XML sitemap module. Islandora, we have the ability to be indexed by Google Scholar through the Islandora Scholar suite of modules. So Islandora Scholar is essentially the suite of modules that provides institutional repository functionality for Islandora, so creating IRs. And so there is a specific setting in Islandora Scholar that helps us apply meta tags to the citation and thesis content models to make them discoverable in Google Scholar. Sorry, lots of scholars. So I'm just going to quickly show you to that interface before we move on. So I'm getting back to my demo site. I'm just going to grab a sip of water, one moment. All right, so I'm going to exit out of there, and we're going to go find the Islandora Scholar configuration for Google Scholar. So I start again with the Islandora menu at the top of the screen, and then I go to Solution Pack Configuration. So this lists all of the solution packs that come included with Islandora. I'm going to scroll to the bottom and click on Scholar. So you can see here it's fairly well labeled. There is a Google Scholar search configuration section, and we can check this box to say that we want to render Google Scholar search links. And so this will render those search links for only 2 content models in our repository. So not images, not video, not audio. This will render Google Scholar search links only for the citation content model and the thesis content model. And these 2 content models are intended for scholarly communications, papers, thesis and dissertation. And so this configuration is there for those 2 content models only. I actually have a Google alert set up for Islandora in the regular Google and Google Scholar. And I can tell you I get multiple emails every day with Islandora content being discovered in Google and Google Scholar. So new content being added all the time. I see the proof of it every day in my email box. All right, so we're about 3/4 the way through. We're going to talk very briefly next about the Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting, also fondly known as OAI-PMH. We like it because it's shorter. So OAI-PMH, it's a low barrier mechanism for repository interoperability. In essence, it's a protocol for metadata harvesting, and it just provides a really simple technical option for data providers to make content available to other services. And when I say other services, I mean DPLA, Europeana, WorldCat, Primo Central, Summon, EBSCOhost, ResearchIt, for example. So I'm probably forgetting some, but those are very common service providers that will harvest content from lots of sources, from an ILS, from a digital repository, and other. So OAI-PMH, it is based on open standards, and it has 6 requests, or 6 types of requests that are delivered over the web through HTTP, and what is returned is an XML response. So this is for metadata harvesting only, not for preservation file harvesting. That's just a quick clarification. So in Islandora, we have this wonderful module called Islandora OAI, and it is well documented, of course, on the DuraSpace wiki, as always. And I'm just going to take you through a quick overview or a quick tour of the configuration interface for that module. So I'm going back to my demo site, and I'm going to exit out of the Islandora Scholar bit. And I'm going to start, of course, back up at the Islandora menu at the top. And then I'm going to click Islandora Utility Modules. And then I'm going to click Islandora OAI. And so there are a couple of things that you need to fill out. In an Islandora installation, these should be pre-filled with most of the information that you would need. What you'll need to add or revise is the repository name. So this name should be a serious name. This is just a demo name, but it will be included in the XML response to harvesters. So make sure that it represents your repository. The OAI2 is the standard prefix there. You can leave that alone. And you'll add a repository identifier. You do other things like configure the administrator email. So this is the contact information for your repository if people need to get in touch with you. You define the maximum response size for harvest. So this is really important because you could have millions of things, millions of objects in your repository, and harvesting them all at once could have a negative impact on your server. It would definitely increase the load on your server. So we can break harvests up into smaller, more manageable increments. So we can say that the maximum response size would be 10, 20, 60, 100, 500. And we can test this after we set a maximum response size, and maybe just keep an eye on your server to make sure that the harvests aren't having a negative impact on performance. The other thing to note here is you can set the expiration time. I always find this a bit funny because you set the expiration time in seconds. And in the documentation or in the note here, it says that 86,400 seconds is 1 day. So good to know, fun fact. So you can configure the amount of time before the harvest or the response will expire. So you can see here we have an OAI request handler, and we can configure that as well. And I'm going to click configure over here on the right-hand side of the screen, just so that we can take a look at the type of information that lives here. So for example, you can select a date field, and this is important. You can see here this says FGS last modified date _DT, and _DT just stands for date. So this is how we can ensure that newly ingested objects are harvested and recently edited objects in a repository are harvested. So we can look at the FGS last modified date value and harvest response sets based on that. So that's really important. We can also identify how we define sets. So we can say is member of a collection or is member of is indicative of how we can define sets. And also, if we need to exclude content models, we need to define how content model is defined. And so here we have defined that the system can look for content models using this field type. So relsx has model _URL. So we'll take a look down here. There are a couple of really important settings here. The two that I'll highlight is being able to append a thumbnail to the request. If possible, I think that's a great idea to have a visual representation of your XML response in the harvester, wherever that may be. The other one that's really important would be forcing to include a link to the object within Islandora. So what this means is anything that's harvested, you will have a link that will help the user who finds this content in whatever aggregator it's in. They'll have a link back to your digital repository site so that they can see the actual object, the preservation file, the full record, and take a look on your site as well. And so that's all we'll take a look at for the OAI module. If anyone's interested, I'll exit out of the configuration interface, and I'll just show you a couple of OAI-PMH request responses. So for example, one of the OAI-PMH requests is called list sets. And essentially it will list all of the sets in a repository. So what you do is you append the OAI request, and I've highlighted the request here, to the end of your URL. And this is how you can test to make sure that your digital repository is configured correctly for harvest. And I'll increase the size of this, hopefully. Yeah. And so I do have some links that I can share with people in the follow-up email after this webinar so that they can try to append some OAI-PMH requests to their own repositories and see what the results are. It's probably the quickest way to figure out if your module is enabled and configured and if the responses are what you think they should be based on your knowledge and familiarity with your content. So we're running a little low on time, so I'm not going to go through a number of requests, OAI-PMH requests, but I will include those in the follow-up email. So I wanted to go over some really quick top takeaways from this discussion, and I think they should be that discovery matters and it should be prioritized, both on your digital repository site and through other sources like aggregators and search engines. The tools are fairly easy to configure and they all have wonderful documentation thanks to the Islandora documentation interest group and the many volunteers. And also that there is help available. So there is documentation, as I mentioned, but also discussion forums. So I've hyperlinked the general DuraSpace Islandora wiki here, terrific documentation. The other thing I'll note is that there's an Islandora metadata interest group. And these people get together every month, or one Monday every month. I'm a member of this group, and I find these sessions really, really helpful. I learn something every time I attend a meeting, and people are more than willing to share what they've done, the tools that they use, resources that they've come across. And it's great to get to know people who are experiencing similar challenges that you may be as well. So for me, these are the top takeaways, and I would be interested in the Q&A session to hear what additional takeaways anyone else may have. So with that, and about 12 minutes remaining in the hour, sorry for hogging all the time, why don't we go to questions? So I'm going to go into the questions interface. I know that there have been a lot of comments about audio, and I apologize for any complications. And I'll go through to see if I can see some questions related to metadata management and discovery. Okay. So one question I have here, does Islandora provide search service for federated search? So Islandora content can be harvested by federated search services, certainly. For example, I know at least one organization that has their content harvested by WorldCat, and that is available through the Islandora OAI module. Does that answer your question? Thinking real time. So there's another question here about how you can restrict search results based on allowed namespaces. So namespaces, for people who may not be aware, is a way that we can subdivide content within Islandora. And so we have a fairly general namespace configuration. Oof, I'll decrease the size of that. We have a very general namespace configuration in Islandora, and it's available under Islandora and configuration. And then there's a link here that says namespaces. So on any Islandora site, we can enforce namespace restrictions. And so that means we would enforce namespace restrictions for both browsing content and searching content. So this is where we can identify the namespaces that should be able to be browsed and searched on a specific Islandora site. Okay, more questions. One moment, I'm reading. There's one question: what version of Islandora is the Islandora collection search available in? Let me just do a quick search. One moment. Islandora collection search. I think it would be available in 7.1.4 and further, but I can check on that and update you guys in the follow-up email. The version for collection search. I'm just making a quick note. I know that this module was created for a client of ours not too long ago. It looks like it continues to be updated, but I believe it was created about 2 years ago, and I think that would align with rather 7 version 1.3 or 1.4. So another question is that it appears that collections with varying metadata schemas, for example, Dublin Core, Qualified Dublin Core, and mods, are supported in an Islandora site. Is that correct? Yes, that's absolutely correct. Islandora has the capability to support any XML-based metadata schema. So it could be Mark XML, PB Core XML, VRA Core XML, and actually I'll do another quick search and I'll just show you some of the Islandora metadata forms that are available through the community, and that'll give us an idea of the breadth of metadata schemas that are already supported. So Islandora XML forms. I believe this lives in Islandora Labs. One moment. And so as I scroll through, you will be able to see that Islandora has a lot of resources available, not just through the standard install, but also through modules that people are contributing just for testing and for general interest. So let me go through here. Services, forms, where are forms? There we go. So this is a quick look at Islandora ingest forms that have been contributed by other community members. So we can see DC, Darwin Core, there's a data site form that was contributed by UPEI. EAC, CPF, and MADS are both for entities, so people, places, events, and organizations. There's FGDC, Lido, and a number of others. So it is a very flexible framework that really can support any XML-based schema. The good thing about the ones listed here is that you already have an XML form for metadata entry and editing available, and you already have a map or an XSLT that will map that schema to Dublin Core. So those are 2 things that you need in order to support a schema. In addition to that, you would also need to tell Apache Solr to index that schema. So I guess those are the 3 things that you would need, but DC, QDC, and mods are already supported. Any other questions? So there's a follow-up question to namespace restriction for search results. And the participant says the Solr settings has a query default setting that has a text field for limit results to specific namespaces. I was hoping we could use this to whitelist search results. So let's go there and check it out. So I'm going back to Islandora, to Solr index, and then to Solr settings. and we're going to query defaults. So this isn't an area that I use very regularly, but you're right. We can enter a comma-separated list of namespaces to restrict results to PIDs with those namespaces. So for example, you would essentially combine this configuration with the configuration in the general, so that the allowed namespaces. Here you could further narrow namespaces for search. It's worth noting though that if a namespace isn't allowed through the general Islandora namespace configuration, it would not be able to be added and searched here. At least I don't think so. But that really would require some testing on my behalf. It was viewer 39 who asked that question, and I can follow up with you on that test, but I have not tested that yet. Any other questions? All right. So I'll just put the slides back up. If you think of a question, I know anytime I hang up the phone, I think of the best question I've ever thought of. So if you think of a question after we hang up or while you're having coffee tomorrow morning, please just jot down my email address. Feel free to email me with questions, and I can likely point you to existing resources that will help answer those questions. So we really look forward to sending you some additional resources, also the link to the recording that will be put up on YouTube later this afternoon. And thanks for bearing with the beeping and other audio troubles. For those of you who may have had difficulty listening to the entire session live, we will be sending that video link out very soon. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate you stopping by for the webinar. All right, have a great day, guys. Take care.